Oh, the picture, I mean.
Yeah. I think that's supposed to be Noah. That's supposed to be us. That's us struggling to keep our head above water in personal floods. All right. So tonight is the beginning of a new season, a new year. We've had our holiday season, the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shemini Atzeres, Simchas Torah. We celebrated the completion of the Torah and started anew. We had last Shabbos, Parshas Bereshit. Now we're ready to get started another big year of learning Torah together. So we start this week's Torah portion, Parshas Noach, and we're just going to jump right in because I'm going to try this year to get us closer to an hour instead of 90 minutes.
Okay.
It's a big change for me. Probably end up somewhere like 75 minutes for a while trying to get to an hour. But let's see what we can do. Now, in this week's Torah portion, the big story, of course, is the flood. You see this artistic rendition of a person keeping their head above water in the flood. Now, the flood was brought on to the entire world by God. And the story tells us of the great protagonist, Noach. Noach and his family, and a sampling of all the animals on earth were saved inside of an ark. Now, within this ark, they lived for approximately a year, and after the flood began to subside, Noach would now have to start thinking about the future. Right? This inhabited world with all of its troubles is now the past. It's been washed away by the flood. And now, Noach, when it comes time when the flood is over, it's time for him to start thinking about the future. So here, where the flood is beginning to subside, is where we pick up for tonight's class. Tonight's class, we're going to be talking about, first of all, we're going to analyze this account of when Noach began to start planning for the future and the peculiar details of the account as it relates to sending off two birds from the ark. Before Noach and his family and all the animals disembark, they go off the boat, so to say, in order to resettle the land. Before that happens, there's a peculiar story with two birds. So we're going to analyze this story of the two birds, ask a series of questions, and try to understand what these two birds are all about. And through the analysis of these two birds, we're going to learn a lesson about how to deal with personal floods, as it says here. Now, what we mean by personal floods is that the flood will serve as a useful metaphor for, destruction and challenge in our own lives. Let me get the slide to move. Hold on. There we go. All right. So the first text where we start tonight, text number 1, is from this week's Parsha, the 8th chapter of the book of Genesis. So it's verses 6 through 14. And it reads, "And it came to pass at the end of the 40 days that Noah, opened the window of the ark that he had made. And he sent forth the raven, and it went out back and forth until the waters dried up off the earth. And he sent forth the dove from with him to see whether the waters had abated from upon the surface of the earth. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of its foot, so it returned to him to the ark, because there was water upon the entire surface of the earth. So he stretched forth his hand and took it, and he brought it to him to the ark. And he waited again another 7 days, and he again sent forth the dove from the ark. And the dove returned to him at eventide, and behold, it had plucked an olive leaf in its mouth. So Noach knew that the water had abated from upon the earth. And he again waited another 7 days, and he sent forth the dove, and it no longer continued to return to him. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month, that the waters dried up upon the earth, and Noach removed the covering of the ark, and he saw, and behold, the surface of the ground had dried up. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry." This is our story. It's from these 9 verses that we're going to base our analysis, in particular focusing on the story and the details of the birds. Now, this story raises a few questions. So first of all, why a raven and a dove? What was it exactly that Noach was trying to accomplish by sending out these birds? Now, the basis of this question is that we'll see a few verses later in the Torah, not in text 1, but a few verses later in the reading of the Torah, that God himself was the one who commanded Noach to leave the ark. And it was only after God gave the command that Noach and his family, in fact, left the ark. So if it was going to take God's command to leave the ark, just like it took God's command to go into the ark, if it took God's command to leave the ark, what was Noach trying to accomplish? What was he so anxious to find out about so that he was sending out these birds, checking if the time had come? Right? If you know you're not allowed to leave somewhere until someone tells you, what difference does it make if you check the conditions are ripe for you to leave? Even if they would be ripe, until God says to go, it's not time to go. So why didn't Noach wait patiently? What was he hoping to accomplish by sending out these birds? Now, that's question number one. The second question is, why specifically did Noach send these two different birds? So if we think back, we go again back to the text, it says that he sent out a raven, and the raven didn't give him really any information. He sent out the dove a few times. So why the raven and the dove? What's the specific meaning behind the birds that he chose to do this mission, which is whatever this mission is meant to accomplish, because he's anyway going to have to wait until God says. So these are our questions that we start off from this excerpt from this week's Torah portion. Now, this question is a rabbinic question. It's a question which has been asked throughout the ages, as you know, as the attentive readers of the Torah throughout the years are analyzing every detail of the story. So this question has been asked. This is by the Emek Davar, or Ha'amak Davar, and on the verse in our text number 1. He says, think about it. Why did Noach choose specifically these birds, the raven and the dove? Are there no birds that fly better than them? Meaning, are these the most fit physically for the task? Furthermore, how did Noach have permission to let these two birds out of the ark before the time came for everyone else to leave? So it's kind of like the inverse of the questions we asked before. You know, what did the opening accomplish? How is he allowed to send the birds out? That's the second question. The first one is like, why these birds? You think? I think the eagle, right, is known to be the strongest of all the birds flying. It can go the highest up, and you have falcons that are the fastest of the birds. So what are we accomplishing by sending out these ravens and pigeons? Now, to go a step further, what's especially difficult to understand is the purpose of sending out the raven. See, when it comes to the dove, the text number 1 told us clearly what Noach was hoping to accomplish by sending out the dove. He hoped to accomplish that to see if the waters had abated or not. Was the flood over? Could we land? But when it comes to the raven, all it says is that he sent forth the raven. That's all it says. What's the reason? The dove at least has a reason stated in the verse, but what's the reason for the raven? What's the mission? And if we're to assume that the raven does have a mission, the verses don't tell us that the bird did its job. It seems like it just kind of was flying around the boat, after being sent out. It neglected to do whatever job it was that it was supposed to be sent out for in the first place. So what exactly is going on with the raven? Now again, this is not a unique question. If we look at the Orach Chaim asks such a question, and it says, and he sent the raven. The Orach Chaim, that's the direct quote from the verse. The Orach Chaim asks, why did he send it? If the purpose was to see if the waters had abated, the verse should have stated so, as it did with the dove's mission. So since the verse is silent on whatever mission the raven has, we're left to wonder, what exactly is it that Noach is hoping to accomplish with this raven? All right, so our questions are clear so far?
Yes.
We have a series of questions already. So first we have our messenger pigeon, our post-flood postal service, right? So the Yonah, the Hebrew word for a dove, could be translated either as a dove or a pigeon. Now, both birds, both pigeons and doves, are famous throughout human history as messengers. Now, they come from the same type of family of bird, and they have a unique ability to fly great distances. And even if you were to take them and move them a few hundred miles away from home and just let them loose, they would know somehow how to get back exactly to where they came from. So these birds have been used and trained as effective messenger birds throughout history. Now, there's a number of cases, there are famous cases where this is the case. The Roman army, led by Julius Caesar, used messenger pigeons to give out vital information to the army. You have the wars, the Great Wars, the World War I and World War II, where pigeons were used for spying and for delivering messages by the Allies. So you have like millions of communications used throughout, prior to email. Which if we learned anything in the last few months, how unsafe it is to send sensitive messages by email. The pigeons are much more safe. They're not going to be lost on your server anywhere. So Noach bred pigeons, we're going to see, for his own personal use. One explanation for what these birds were all about and how Noach was allowed to send the birds is that they were different than the birds or all the animals that Noach brought on the ark to save from the flood. See, because pigeons and ravens have been used as messenger birds, this wasn't Noach saving these animals necessarily, according to one explanation, but in a sense it was Noach's messenger system that he brought with him, right? We were talking before class about how everyone has a cell phone nowadays. So Noach wanted to bring his cell phone with him onto the boat, He brings his own personal messenger system, his birds. So let's see that explanation. Previously we quoted from the Amakadover. So let's see how it explains this here. It says, I would suggest that this raven and dove were not among the pairs brought into the ark upon God's command for the purpose of breeding offspring. Rather, before the flood, Noach was a nobleman, and the custom then was for noblemen to raise ravens and doves. These birds entered the ark as part of Noach's household. Homegrown ravens are not sent far, but doves are used for traveling long distances and to carry letters and bring back various objects in its mouth. Thus, when Noach sent the raven and it saw only water, it stayed put rather than travel far. So he sent the dove, who was used to flying on faraway missions. So a very practical answer, which settles some of the questions, at least on one level, is that the reason he's doing all this is because he wants to know, right? There's a phenomenon that I see that takes place now in the 21st century Shabbos, Sabbath observant home, is as soon as Havdalah comes, everyone rushes to their smartphones or to their tablets or to their laptop, whatever it is, to quickly check emails. What are the messages I missed? What's going on Facebook or Instagram? These type of things. Everyone rushes off to see what's going on. So here, imagine Noach is a whole year stuck on a boat, and it's not an easy year, obviously. It's a year of destruction. It's a year of taking care in a very troubling way of all these animals. And he's wanting to know, when is this over? I'm going to check my email and see what's going on. So he sends out his birds. So this makes it at least a good answer on one level the questions. But we still have the explanation for why the dove went out. But it makes our last question, the question about the raven, even more perplexing. Because if Noach knows, according to text number 4, that the dove was the better of the messenger birds, it was used to flying further distances, then why did he send the raven first if the dove is better suited for the task? What was he thinking when he sent out the raven? Okay, so we have our series of questions. We have one practical answer, which means we're going to have to peel away a few layers in order to get to some deeper insight about what Noach was doing with these birds. All right, before we go further to part 2, any questions so far? No questions?
No questions. I'm trying to think of the wording when Hashem said for Noah to bring all the animals in. He gives them instructions, but there wasn't an instruction for him to bring those two.
Right.
So it also begs the question of what gave him the right to bring something in that he wasn't given permission to do.
So the way the Netziv here, the Amokadavar is explaining it, is it's like personal property.
Right.
Noach was able to pack a bag, so to say, and he had his own personal property in addition to the task that he was given.
So was it that he didn't know where he was, so he sent out the raven and the dove to compare the distance?
No. So that's one of the problems we still have. One of the problems we still have, that was the Or Chaim's question. The Or Chaim's question was, wait a second, the dove we understand. The dove we understand for multiple reasons. The dove we understand, first of all, because the verse says explicitly to send it out to check. And the dove we understand practically, according to text number 4. The dove's well suited for this job. So that leaves us with the two forms of the same question. What's going on with the raven? The raven, the verse doesn't tell us at all what the raven's for. It just says that he sends it out. And if the point is to get the message back, if the land isn't settled, ravens don't go very far as messenger birds. So it was a bad choice. It's got a weaker signal than your pigeon communication device. So we're left with 2 layers of question as to what's going on with this raven. All right, any other questions? So, moving on to part number 2. So part 2 is what we're going to do, is we're going to take a look at how the Torah gives us sort of like an insight into the character of these birds. And we'll be able to understand better the reason for Noach sending them out. What was their mission of being sent out from the ark, if we first consider the character of the bird. What kind of bird are we talking about here? Now, there are multiple sources in Jewish texts which point to a negative character for the raven. The raven has we might even call it a wicked character, according to Torah. So, the first such text is straight from the book of Psalms, chapter 147, the 9th verse, where it's translated into English. It says, He, meaning God, gives the animal its food to the young ravens that call out. So, if you look at the verse, when it says the animal, that's speaking very general, right? You can speak to all the animals by using the term animal. But then in the second half of the verse, it gets very specific. It talks about ravens. So the question that the Medrash is going to answer, or ask and answer, is why are ravens singled out? Why are they listed particularly in this verse as the beneficiaries of God's kindness, God's chesed? So the reason is because of the wicked nature of ravens. Ravens are cruel animals that leave their young with no way to live. They abandon their young. That's text 5b from the Medrash Yalkut Shmoini. It says, how do we know the raven is cruel to its children? So the verse states, this is a verse in the book of Job, who prepares for the raven his prey when his young cry out to God. Furthermore, the verse states, and this is the verse in Tehillim, to the young ravens that call out. So both of these verses combined tell us about the cruel nature of the raven. How so? When a raven mothers children, the male says to the mother that perhaps some other bird is the father and rejects the children and abandons them. So what does God do? He brings forth mosquitoes from their waste for them to eat and develop. So from their own waste, they're able to eat from the insects that grow out of it. So this is the kindness that the Medrash is explaining to us that God has to do to give the young ravens, when they call out, to giving them their food, because they've gotten this predicament because of the cruel nature of their parents. Now, this is maybe a species-wide problem, right? Which the verse in Tehillim and the verse and the explanation of Medrash is coming to point out. But we also have, the Talmud tells us the story within the ark of a wicked nature of the raven for a different reason. Now, the flood, again, it's a fantastic story to try to imagine, but you have flood raging all over the world. And all of the living creatures are being destroyed. It's a tremendous tragedy. And Noach and his family, his 3 sons and their wives, as well as all the animals, were forbidden in that time to engage in physical intimacy. Now, this is a law which we learn out in Jewish practice, that in times of tragedy, like national tragedy, it's just not an appropriate time for intimacy, so it's forbidden. So you couldn't have a greater tragedy than all of the creatures on earth being destroyed, so this was a time it was forbidden. And yet, while almost all of the animals understood and fulfilled this prohibition, we see that there were some that didn't. So let's see the next text. Text 6 in the Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin. It says, the rabbis have taught there were 3 who cohabited in the ark, and each of them was stricken. It was the dog, the raven, and Noach's son, Ham. So just focusing on the raven, we see that the raven was so indulgent in its own pleasures that it didn't have the sensitivity of what was going on around it. And the rest of the world was being destroyed. That didn't matter. The raven was still this wicked character that wasn't affected by that and still could just have the appetite for pleasure in the face of such destruction. So, all right. We're going to have a window into the character of these birds. Ravens doesn't have a good window, right? It's not a good view from that window into what kind of creature this is. Now, if we contrast the dove to the raven, doves are gentle and caring and represent love and kindness, right? Until today, the dove is a symbol of peace. Many world organizations use the dove as a symbol for peace. In the English language, we use doves as those who are peaceful, right? You can describe a politician by calling them a dove as opposed to a hawk, right? People who are hawkish are into war. People who are dovish are into peace. So the very nature of the bird is used as a symbol in our language. Now, this positive depiction of the dove is also found in the Torah, just like the negative depiction of the raven. So where do we see this? Oh, this is a summary of what we said before. The raven is mean, it's cruel and selfish, and they abandon their young, and so that's why the verse in Tehillim tells us that he gives the animals food, the young ravens to call out. Now,
we just read that section because of the time of month it is.
That's right. Now, the Song of Songs, in the first chapter of Shir Shirim, the 15th verse there, it says this is the whole book written by King Solomon describes in metaphoric language the relationship between God and the soul, God and the Jewish people. And the prevalent metaphor is the romantic love between a man and a woman. Now, there's other metaphors used there, and here we see, behold, you are comely, my beloved, behold, you are comely, your eyes are like doves. Now, here we already see positive language when it's describing the dove. But in the next text, from Shir Shirim Rabbah, the Medrash of Shir Shirim, we see a much more elaborate and effusive praise for both the dove as well as the Jewish people. We see here it says, just as a dove is wholesome, Israel is pleasant and in their way when they travel to Jerusalem for the 3 holidays. Just as a dove excels, Israel excels. Just as a dove is modest, Israel is modest. Just as a dove is faithful to its spouse, Israel is faithful to God. Just as a dove doesn't abandon its nest, even if its chicks are taken from it, so to the Jewish people, though their temple is destroyed, they don't abandon their 3 festivals. Just as a dove hatches new offspring each month, Jewish people renew each month Torah, mitzvahs, and good deeds. Just as a dove travels great distances and returns to its nest, so too the Jewish people. Just as the dove brought light to the world, the Jewish people bring light to the world. As it is written, and nations shall go by your light. Now, the Medrash asks, when did a dove bring light to the world? In the days of Noach. As it is written, and the dove returned to him at eventide, and behold, it had plucked an olive leaf in its mouth. So we see, even based on the story we're trying to analyze, the Medrash is coming to explain all of these positive qualities of the character of this bird, as we can even see it in our story. Now, not only all of these positive character traits can we label the dove with, but the dove is also one of the animals that was used for sacrificial service. The next verse from the book of Leviticus, chapter 1, verses 14, says, and if it's sacrificed to God as a burnt offering from birds, right, is this whole big set of creatures to choose from. If you're going to bring one from birds, he shall bring it from turtle doves or from young doves. So of all the birds you could possibly bring, all the kosher birds that are on earth, the one that's chosen to be used as the sacrifice to God is the dove. So we're pitting a real good versus evil type thing over here, right? The raven and the dove, and we see their character from the window, the view of Torah. So, gentle, caring, love, kindness. These are, we put the 2 slides side by side. We've got the good and evil, right? Clearly, a real difference. Now, so from this, our question becomes even more difficult to understand. Why in the world, if you're looking at the character of the birds, why in the world would Noach start with the raven? If he's hopefully looking forward to the future when he can resettle the earth, right, and leave the ark and all of the destruction it represents, and repopulate and do all the things he has to do to rebuild civilization. Looking forward, why would you start things off with the raven? What was he trying to accomplish? The question just becomes even stronger when we take the lens of their character of the bird to try to understand the story. So again, this is a question which is asked by our rabbis. This is the Ber Mayim Chaim, Rabbi Yitzhak of Chernovitz. So it says, our sages of blessed memory have said that the raven encircled the ark and did not go to fulfill its errand because it suspected Noach concerning its mate. So we quoted from the Talmud before, right? That the raven didn't stop from cohabiting with its from inside the ark. The Medrash says that the bird was not only indulgent but also jealous. And the bird thought that if he left his mate with Noach, that Noach would cohabit with his mate also. So he didn't want to take his eyes off him very much. So why, he asks, this is such a terrible bird, why, from all species, did Noach choose to send the raven? Didn't he know that the raven was wicked from the fact that it cohabited in the ark? State, a good person heralds good tidings and not a wicked person. So, again, this is another layer to our problem, is if we add the view of the character and wrestling with the problem that the the dove clearly has a mission. And we could try to assume that the raven has a mission, that it's a means to an end, and we just don't know what it is. It's not really suited to send out on long missions because they fly short missions. We got around the commandment part by saying the raven is his own personal bird, but even then it doesn't make sense because it doesn't go very far. We look at like the nature of the bird. It doesn't seem like a good kind of creature to be doing business with. So what are you expecting? Good things from this bird? So until now we've been thinking this as it has a mission. It's a means to an end. So that what we're going to answer is that sending the bird out, sending the raven out first, was when we think of it from the perspective of the character of the bird, sending the bird out was in fact itself an end. Rather than a means to an end, rather than a bird being sent on a mission, sending the bird out was itself an accomplishment. It was getting rid of the raven. See, Noach had just come from a world filled with evil, filled with problems. And here he was about to press restart and repopulate the world. So by sending the raven out, because it's such a bad bird, that was a message as to what direction is Noach heading in. He's getting rid of the raven. He's getting rid of the evil and the wickedness that it represents. So let's do that in text 9b. This is the same Be'er Mayim Chaim of Chernobyl. It says, I would suggest that Noach did not send the raven on a mission to tell if the earth had dried up or not. Proof of this is that the fact, while regarding the dove, the verse states it explicitly. He sent the dove to see if the waters had abated from upon the surface of the earth. Here, the verse writes nothing of the sort, just that he sent forth the raven. It went out, back and forth. So rather, he's going to explain, what does it mean? The intention was this. The word raven, so the word raven in Hebrew is spelled Ayin, Vav, Resh, Ves, Orev. So the word raven is comprised of the same letters as the word as Avra, Ayin, Ves, Resh, He, which is anger. Or you could, so this trait of wickedness, or the traits of wickedness, are ingrained in the raven. Therefore, it cohabited in the ark, though cohabitation was forbidden. Our sages of blessed memory have said the raven is cruel even to its children. All of this indicates the root of evil. Now, Noach, in contrast, was particularly righteous, for he sustained and fed all the animals in the ark for 12 months at great personal cost, to the point that he was groaning and spitting blood from their burden. He could not tolerate such a cruel creature and did not want to live in close quarters with the root of evil. So he sent off the raven, banishing it so he would no longer have to be together with it. This is the next answer, the next level of answer, not from a practical perspective, but really from a symbolic perspective. It's precisely because of the character of the bird that Noach sent it off. See, our question was all the time predicated that the bird had some type of utility. The bird was accomplishing something, was going on a mission. But what the Be'er Mayim Chaim is explaining to us is that no, the bird is actually itself wicked, and that is why Noach sent it off. He sent it off first, because he was trying to get rid of the evil that was around him. Now, this idea of the order, the raven going out first, and only after the dove, to send out the evil first and then the good, this is actually not limited to the chronological order of our story. But rather, the rabbis explain this is a natural procession. This is the natural order of how good and evil operate. That evil always precedes good. Now, the metaphor that is used in Kabbalistic teaching is the idea of the shell and the fruit, or the shell and the nut. So you have I have a bowl of oranges right now in my kitchen. So you have the shell right on the outside and the fruit on the inside. So the shell, the klipa, grows before the fruit. So this is a metaphor for the evil growing before the good, or going before the good. Let's see how that works. There's Noach sent the raven and then the dove, just as Esau preceded Yaakov, because the peel always grows before the fruit. So the peel, and this is like the Kabbalah of negativity, right? So the peel, the word for peel in Hebrew is klipa. So Kabbalah explains that all the evil in this world can be likened to the peel of a fruit. See, the peel is tough, it's bitter, it's not to be consumed. But hidden within this peel, in a certain deeper perspective, even protected within the peel, God put inside the beautiful fruit. So God created the world in such a way that in order for us to reach the sweetness, the goodness of the fruit in life, we have to first peel away the klipa. We first have to get past the peel stage. So every seemingly negative challenge must be overcome in order to reveal a treasure within it. This is like a deeper insight into negativity and the negative experience. And again, we're going to talk about the take-home lesson for tonight is our own personal flood, how to deal with tragedy. And so the details of these birds are going to give us that insight. So Be'er Mayim Chaim is telling us is by sending away the raven, that is a deeper lesson for us to understand how to deal with our own flood as well. All right, that's the end of part 2. Any questions on part 2? All right, so part 3 is where we get to our personal lesson. Now, the personal lesson will be like, what can we take from this story? It's a fantastic story, meaning it's really hard. It's so hard to get our head around how all this works, a global flood and wiping out all of existence, So the personal lesson that we're going to derive from this story tonight is if we think of the flood as a metaphor for personal suffering, right? The flood, in a literal reading of the story, is a global tragedy. It was global suffering. It was the destruction of all living creatures. But if we want to take a personal lesson from it, we want to maybe understand how each and every one of us has our own flood to deal with. Now, how do we deal with our own personal floods? The story of the raven and the dove come to teach us a lesson, a multi-step process on how to deal with our own personal tragedies, our own challenges. So what we explained in part 2 is that the raven is cold, right? It abandons its own children, leaves them to starve. And the dove is warm. It represents love, and it's used in Shir Shirim to represent warmth and passion. So we have cold and callous, warm and loving. So these two dynamics from these two birds represent the two attributes, the two divine attributes of gvura, in the case of the raven, severity, and chesed, in the case of the dove, loving kindness. Now these are the two primary character traits that are discussed in Kabbalah and Chassidus that make up the emotional experience, the emotional range of our experience. Now Kabbalah explains this whole process, which we've gone over before in previous class, especially in our Shabbos morning classes, about the intellectual leads to the emotions and the whole range of emotions. But the emotions can be primarily categorized as gevura and chesed, severity and loving kindness. Now, we're going to see a few texts here from Tanya, which just introduces us to some of the terms. So, before we get there, we have our icons, right? Chesed and gevura, and so the dove matches up with chesed, and the raven matches up with gevura. So again, we're trying to understand what can we learn as a lesson from the story of the flood. Our flood is our personal challenges. So what's our raven and our dove? And that is the approaches of Gevurah and Chesed. So let's go a step further. Let's understand Gevurah and Chesed a little bit more. So quoting from the Tanya, the foundational work of Chabad Chassidus, in the section called the Geras HaKodesh, the Holy Letters, it's the last section of the Tanya. So in the 15th letter there it says, now, as regards the totality of the 10 sefirot, as they are in the soul of man, it is known to all that the attributes are generally divided into 7 emotive attributes, called the midot, and all the specific traits in man derive from one of these 7 attributes, right? So this great range of emotional experience, with all its shades and levels, really could all be boiled down into a framework of 7 emotive attributes. Now, these attributes are the root of all the traits. They are the attribute of chesed, which is to share without limit, and the attribute of gevurah, to withhold from sharing so much or from sharing altogether. Now, there's a lot to say about these 2 character traits. We're just excerpting one little part of the Tanya, and there's all kinds of, a whole sea of literature, lots of ink has been spilled, as they say, on this topic. So what's relevant for our discussion, though, tonight, about the lesson we can learn from a flood, what does the raven and the dove teach us about our own personal challenges, is to think about how these attributes of Gevurah and Chesed impact the way people serve God, the way people live their lives. So earlier in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains that with regards to learning Torah, regards to doing mitzvahs, people can be broken up into 2 categories, right? I like the line. All people can be broken up into 2 categories. Those who put people in 2 categories. So everybody's observance of Torah and mitzvahs can be categorized, divided into 2 categories. Generally speaking, you've got chesed people and gevurah people. So let's see that in the next text. Among the divine servants, right, that's us, there are 2 degrees and levels that, depending on the root of their souls above, are distinct in relation to the categories of right and left. That is, the characteristic of the left is the trait of contraction, tzimtzum, and concealment. And from this attribute derives also the aspect of contraction and limitation in divine service. For example, with charity. If you're going away of the left, you should not expend more than 1/5. That's the limit. And likewise, as regards the study of Torah and all the other commandments. A person from the left makes do with discharging his duty, the definite duty to which the Torah obliges him, and no more. By contrast, the characteristic of the right is the attribute of grace, attribute of chesed, and extension in divine service by way of expansion without any contraction and concealment whatsoever. There is no restraint to the spirit of his generosity, whether it be with respect to charity, study of Torah, or other commandments. He does not suffice in discharging his obligation only, but to the extent of it's ad bli dai, never sufficient what I've done. Now, so the Alter Rebbe he's one of 2 types of people, right? He's put people into 2 categories. You're either on the left, gevurah, or you're on the right, chesed. Now, his particular area of focus in this part of the Tanya is and how that manifests itself in divine service. But it's really the brilliance of this system, this binary, the system, is that it manifests itself in all areas of life, not just divine service. You have it in our social interactions as well, right? The example is extroversion and introversion. You have that. What's the test? Briggs-Meyer. The Briggs-Meyer test. Are you an E or an I? You know, an extrovert or introvert. So how does that work? This is social interaction, not just divine service. It's human interaction. An introvert is closed in. Introvert has energy that comes from being alone, being quiet, being, solitary moments of reflection. The extrovert gets their energy from interacting, being with people, being in the middle of everything. So we see not just in divine service is this framework useful, but this framework is useful for really all aspects of life. So going back to our case, again, we're trying to derive a lesson from this story. In our case, the kind, loving dove represents chesed, the attribute of chesed. And the cold, callous raven represents gevura. Now we have to go back and understand what's the lesson from Noach's story. Noach's story, we have a flood. That's our personal challenge. Noach first sends out the raven, and then sends out the dove. So first gevura, step 1, then chesed, step 2. So let's see how that works. So we have our icons, the love and chesed and gevura here at the bottom, and we have what comes next after the flood. So the idea that we can take as our lesson is that the most devastating destruction ever known to mankind, the flood. Noach was right after that, after the greatest tragedy that could be. After witnessing all of humanity descend into the abyss, both morally and ethically as well as physically, to be wiped out the face of the earth. Noach was now the one who was chosen to rebuild mankind. So that's a big task in front of him. So how does he go about rebounding? How does he go about, taking on this big mission? So Noach thought, and what Noach teaches us is that step 1 is first the raven, first gevura, trying to understand how the world got so bad in the first place. Now, the next text we see, this is the last text for tonight, is that it's another quote from the Tanya. And here is not from Igeres Kodesh, this is from the second book of the Tanya, Shar Yichud Ba'amunah. And it's this 4th chapter. It says, when listing the praises of the Holy and Blessed be He, it is written, HaGadol v'HaGibor, the great and the mighty. HaGadol refers to the attribute of chesed, kindness, and spreading unending, unlimited life force into all worlds and created things. This life, this HaGadol of godliness, creates all being from nothing into something and allows them to exist through gratuitous kindness. The attribute of chesed is called gedula. It's called greatness, for it comes from the greatness of the Holy and Blessed be He, in His glory. For God is great, and His greatness is unsearchable. Because God is so great, He also injects life and creates an unlimited number of worlds and creatures from nothing to something, for it is the nature of the beneficent to do good. So Noach, thinking how do we rebuild from this destruction, thought, what got us into this problem in the first place? So this infinite chesed, which is the beginning of creation, it's praiseworthy, it's godly, but it's problematic. It's potentially problematic. If you have only infinite giving without gevura, without restraint, then the world can fall into great decay, moral decay. So what Noach understood is that chesed without gevura, giving without limit, is what gets you into trouble. So after experiencing this tragedy, what Noach understood is I have to send the raven out. I have to start with gevura. I have to establish new boundaries. Where before there was infinite chesed, that's a serious drawback. The pre-flood world didn't have appropriate boundaries. There wasn't sufficient discipline. So whatever you wanted, you indulged. And whatever you saw, you took. And what Noach understood is a lesson to us. that when we're dealing with harmful behaviors, when we're dealing with tragic situations, thinking back into what got us into that mess, what got us into that difficulty, what if it was a result of bad behaviors and bad habits, was a lack of discipline. So the first step in rebounding from the flood is there must be gevurah. You must draw a line that with that negative behavior will only get worse and not better if you don't instill discipline. Now, the example of this you could use is the example of a judge, right? A judge could either be severe or kind. You have someone who's before you and does a crime, and you're a judge. You have two options in front of you. So if you have only chesed, then you only give out lenient sentences, or you pardon people, then you're going to call it moral hazard. People will continue to do worse and worse. The judge isn't doing anyone any favors by only using chesed. So once it gets overrun by wickedness because there's only chesed, we have to draw a line and say this is where we need gevurah. So it's for this reason that Noach first sent the raven to establish gevurah. Now, this kind of boundary setting and restraint in the face of trauma, face of tragedy, exists as a natural defense mechanism psychologically, right? So just imagine to yourself a challenging situation that you've been in your life. You don't have to go so far as to call it tragedy, unless you have such a thing, and then it's easier to feel the severity of the situation. But if you think about that moment, what's a natural reaction is to be guarded, is to be scared of getting into that problem again. So to create boundaries, to create limits which keep you away from that, is natural. What can be damaging, though, is if we stop with just the raven, if we only do step one. So we need to move forward to step two. Step two means there must also be chesed. Because so many of us have difficult experiences, we get emotionally overwhelmed by difficulties, we have our personal flood. And when we have this personal tragedy, we might become cynical or guarded. And we don't trust anymore. We don't connect the way we used to with other people. So step two is after you've established the appropriate boundaries, after you sent out the raven, then you need to send out the dove. The second step is that gevurah on its own cannot rebuild. The primary force that drives rebuilding is love, is giving, is connection. Now, it's natural psychologically to put up walls to protect ourselves when we've been hurt. The next step from this story that we learn is we have to then send out chesed. We have to send out the dove. Now, this is, in the final slide, also the story of the Jewish people. The story of the Jewish people is that it's not just Noach that is a story we can relate to. There's been thousands of years of history where we've experienced trauma as a people, where we've been persecuted, we've been murdered, we've been chased out of one foreign land, and another. Now, it would be natural, and step one, to put up boundaries, to put ourselves in a box, to guard ourselves off from interaction with the world, and then not rebuild, to not re-engage. But the history of the Jewish people is that even after the traumatic times throughout our histories, we have continued to build. And that's the story of Noach. The story of Noach is you have to send out the dove as the second step. All the survivors, both on an individual level as well as a national level, all the survivors understand that introversion alone, withdrawal and distrust, cannot cultivate a Jewish future. cannot cultivate a personal future. We all have pain and disappointment. We can understand the natural reaction to put up a wall. But what we have to learn from this story is step 2, is have to send out the dove. It's through love that we're able to reach our potential. All right, any questions on that?
You can't stop halfway. You don't accomplish anything unless you take the first step first.